Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. Today we're doing part 2 of Leonard Fraser. The first part we talked a lot about Leonard's past and how he was in and out of prison and eventually started to target women to abuse. I will link last week's episode if you want to check that out, but today we're going to get into when he turned serial killer and details on his victims. At the end of the last episode, we left off with Leonard hanging out with a woman by the name of Beverly Lego. So we'll pick up where we left off. Beverly Lego was trying to turn her life around. Her toxic ex-boyfriend, Richard Grit, left her, and she realized how much better off she was without him. She was once again in regular contact with her family and trying to kick her drug habit and treat her schizophrenia. Unfortunately, she was still struggling. She was often seen walking the streets trying to find people who could help her out either with money or sometimes with things so she could self-medicate. On March 1st, Beverly was spotted near the intersection of Bolsvoor and Fitzroy around 9:30 a.m. She was walking towards the Bank of Queensland so she could speak to a bank manager about getting an advance on her money. This would have been a government pension or disability check. And she did this quite often because her money never lasted her very long. On this day, the manager wasn't available that morning, so she left. Leonard Fraser would see her walking down the street and pulled over to ask if she'd like to join him in going to Yeppoon to pick up his sister. Now remember, Leonard used to tell people Christine Wright was his, quote, retarded sister, end quote, when she was actually in fact his disabled girlfriend or sex slave if we're going to be real about it. Anyway, Beverly agreed and once again she got into his car. According to Leonard, he and Beverly had an argument while driving to Yeppoon. He would get so angry that he punched her in the side of the head. He hit her so hard that she immediately slumped over against the passenger door and would begin making gurgling noises and convulsing. Leonard then noticed blood getting on the door of his car, so at this point he wanted to just get rid of her. He decided to drive toward Mount Sleipner, or Sleipner, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, where he remembered there being a swimming hole in Natkin Creek. When driving parallel to the creek, he stopped near a clump of mango trees and got out to inspect Beverly, who now must have been most likely dead. Leonard dragged Beverly about 50 meters from the car through thick bush and thorn where he stopped at a small clearing. He threw Beverly down, ripped off her clothes, and using her sports bra as a noose, he strangled her to death. When he was absolutely sure that she was dead, he would then have intercourse with her dead body. Leonard took a lot of time covering up his tracks by pulling up the trampled grass, making sure nobody would see his path. Next, he placed 3 large rocks in her handbag and tossed it into a river. Afterwards, Leonard remembered that he had another body to deal with, Julie Turner, so he went home and came up with a new plan. Julie Turner, formerly Elder, was born July 31st, 1959. Just like Beverly, she too was abandoned by her mother as a young child. Julie lived with her second cousin's grandmother because her mother didn't want her and her father was too busy working to care for her. Now, being abandoned by her mother and father was something that she just never really got over. As she got older, she ended up being very rebellious and just making poor life choices. She would marry a timber salesman named Rob Turner, and together they had a baby named Kylie. Julie tried her best to be a really good mother. She rarely drank, took good care of the home, but Ron had a drinking problem. By 1984, his drinking and long work hours were just too much for Julie, and they went their separate ways. Julie would get a job as a cleaner and eventually met Steve, a local laborer in Townville where she lived. Julie and Steve would break up when she learned that he was stealing cars, but they got back together for a while before separating again. Steve was sadly killed in a police chase not long after. And even though Julie and Steve had a rocky relationship and were not together at the time, she was devastated by the loss. She started drinking heavily and got into a few more bad relationships. She would then meet a man named Michael McConaughey, and together they moved to Rockhampton. Michael and Julie both had drinking problems, and they fought about everything. Julie was very depressed with her life, so to ease her pain, she spent a lot of time getting very intoxicated in bars. Staff would say that she was always very friendly. She talked to just about anyone, but she would get very sloppy drunk. She just didn't have an off switch when it came to drinking. One night, while at the bar, she met Leonard Fraser, who she referred to as Lenny. To her, he was charming and 1,000 times better than her husband, Michael, who beat her regularly. She often joked that she would leave Michael for Lenny. Lenny told Julie that he lived with his sister, who was a bit silly in the head, which she always assumed meant disabled. This was Christine Wright. She thought it was nice that he took care of his sister, and she even told her daughter Kylie all about Lenny. Then, on December 27th, 1998, Julie had been drinking most of the day and decided that she'd go to the Airport Liberties nightclub. She had been fighting with Michael again and walked to the club to let off some steam. She spoke with one of the longtime bouncers, Jamie McKean, before going inside. Later in the night, the bouncer told Julie to go home because she was just really, really drunk, and he was concerned. He even offered to get her a taxi, but Julie informed him that no, she was not going to go home, but she would see him again next week. She then walked away down Bolser Street, never to be seen again. After 4 days of not hearing from Julie, Michael got worried. Nobody had heard from her, not her friends or her daughter Kylie, which was very out of character. So on New Year's Eve, 1998, Michael would finally go to the police station and file a missing persons report. Police tried to find her, but after about 2 weeks, in January of 1999, homicide detectives were asked to assist. Unfortunately for her husband, Michael, he was looking into further because police knew their home well. There had been a history of domestic violence calls to their home, and Michael had been arrested in the past for breaching a domestic order. He also waited 4 days to report her missing, so he was looking like the number one suspect. Detectives had checked women's shelters, tried to retrace her last steps once she left the club, but she was nowhere to be found. Police also took DNA samples from Michael, grilled him several times, got a warrant to search the home, sprayed luminol on the carpet, and even examined his knife set that he used for hunting. But nothing brought them closer to finding Julie. Kylie, Julie's daughter, she even thought he was responsible as well. The amount of physical fights that she heard about on a regular basis just made her think that the fight went too far and Julie was killed. What really happened was when Julie left the bar on December 27th, Leonard spotted her leaning up against a guardrail having a cigarette in the dark behind the Police and Citizens Youth Club. Before she even knew he was there, he ran towards her and punched her in the back of the head, knocking her out. This punch would break her neck. He later bragged that he heard bones crunching when he broke her neck. Leonard then did what he always did and ripped Julie's clothes off and used her bra to strangle her. He then had intercourse with her limp body. He would leave Julie in the long grass and bushes temporarily and headed home. The next morning, he drove his old car back to where he left Julie and tossed her in the trunk. Leonard would then take Julie to Kinka Beach, carried her about 100 meters off Ramada Road, and laid her on the ground. He did his best to hide her with branches, and then he left because he remembered that he had some grocery shopping to do. He didn't return right away. Instead, he got a new car because it smelt terrible after Julie and his old dead dog were in the trunk. Leonard eventually returned back to Julie's grave, and it's unknown when, so it could have been weeks or even months later. She had already been quite decomposed at this point when Leonard returned, but after hiding Beverly Lego's body, he was worried that he didn't do a good enough job with Julie's. To make sure nobody knew who she was, he decided to remove her head. He accidentally left her lower jaw in the process of pulling her head off her body, which would later help the police to identify her. He then took her head to Kemp Beach in Yeppoon and buried her head near some bushes in a shallow hole. On March 1st, 1999, Beverly Lego's purse would be located. Anne-Marie Hempsall was down at Fitzroy River helping a friend pull crab pots when she noticed a brown leather handbag in the water. This river is actually a tidal river, so the tide was out pretty far this day, so she could easily pick it out of the water. Inside was the license for Beverly Lego. Anne brought the bag and the ID to the Rockhampton police station. Now, the police already had a missing persons report for Beverly filed by her landlord just the day before. Her landlord hadn't seen her since dropping her off in town on February 25th. He was worried about her when she didn't return home and she still hadn't showed up to pay rent. Now, since police had Beverly Lego's handbag, which appeared to be deliberately concealed in the river due to there being large rocks in the handbag, her investigation was sent to homicide. Police then started to link together the missing women of Rockhampton: Beverly Lego, Julie Turner, and Natasha Ryan. And remember her episode we did a few weeks ago. Julie and Beverly were similar in the sense that they both had addiction, they were often seen in bars, and they were similar size as well. Julie had a weird connection to Natasha. She had boarded a home from a man named William Schoonerman, and Natasha had lived in the same home as a child. It's a strange connection, but the only one police could find. All three women also vanished within 6 months of each other. Leonard wasn't a strong suspect at this point. He was pleased with himself and seemed to be off the hook, so he continued to look for more victims. Next was Sylvia Benedetti. Sylvia was born in Melbourne on January 3rd of 1980 and the second child to Betty Hadfield and Sergio Benedetti. Sadly, Sergio was also a predator and used his daughter Sylvia for his urges. It was mostly touching until one day he tried to go further. Sylvia told her mother, and they promptly moved out. Sergio was charged and served time in jail, but that whole thing was very traumatic for Sylvia. Even though she did the right thing, it affected her very, very deeply. She became antisocial, depressed, and often turned violent. Once she lit her neighbor's house on fire and also started to use hard drugs in her early teens. Sylvia ran away at the age of 15, and it's said that she was raped by 4 men when she was 16. She was very broken and very troubled. Leonard had met Sylvia through a mutual friend. Sylvia liked Lenny because he was nice, but mostly because she could score pot from him. Pot was how Leonard lured Sylvia to an abandoned and condemned hotel in Queensland. The hotel at the time was used as a squat house for the homeless and addicted. It was also a place that Leonard liked to go to sell drugs and take things like old TVs, car parts, or other stolen items that addicts left behind. On April 19th, 1999, Leonard saw Sylvia walking home with her arms full of groceries. He kindly offered to help her out, and Sylvia accepted. When they were done with the groceries, Leonard brought Sylvia to the Queensland Hotel because he told Sylvia that he had a ½ ounce of pot upstairs of the hotel hiding. When they arrived, she followed him inside, walking through the dark and deserted hotel. On this evening, nobody else was in there. Leonard led her down a corridor into room 13. Once inside, he turned around and tried to make a sexual advance on Sylvia. Sylvia pushed him off, and that rejection enraged Leonard so much that he punched Sylvia in the mouth as hard as he could. Leonard would then grab a piece of wood, which I believe was a board taken off a window ledge, and swung it hard against her head, cracking her skull to pieces. He would hit her over and over until she was unrecognizable. There was blood splatters all over the walls and ceiling, and bone fragments sprinkled over the carpet. Leonard would later say that Sylvia had screamed when he punched her, so he had to keep hitting her to make sure she shut up. When he was done, he would then have sex with her body, just like he did with the others, which is just sickening. She didn't even have a face anymore. He beat her so bad. Leonard would drag Sylvia's remains into the men's toilets and drop her over a shower drain. He then tried to clean up the mess he made in room 13. He didn't want to go to jail, and he knew he had to cover his tracks. However, this time it was too much. The carpet was soaked in blood, and the blood splatter was 3 meters high, reaching the ceiling. He also didn't have cleaning supplies in this abandoned hotel. So instead, he hid her clothes and shoes in an old freezer that was half full of water and planned to return another time to clean up the mess and get rid of the body. What he didn't know was that the hotel was designated for demolition, and contractors were going to be going through to determine the cost of the demo. Leonard found this out 3 days after he left Sylvia inside. So in a panic, he raced back to the hotel and put Sylvia in the trunk of his car, dripping her blood through the hotel, as well as inside his trunk. He then had to abandon his plans to clean up and just hope that he didn't leave any evidence of himself behind, or that maybe they'd tear it down without walking through. He would drive to Sandy Point near Yeppoon, a popular surf beach. He buried her in a very shallow grave and covered her naked body with bushes and branches. He would later admit that seeing her dead body again just made him want to kill again, and his urges were really strong. But sadly, his next victim was only a child. Kyra Steinhardt was just 9 years old and recently given new independence, which made her so happy and proud. On her 9th birthday, she was officially allowed to walk to and from school without a grown-up. Her parents made sure to tell her to focus on her walk. Stay on the sidewalk, don't talk to strangers, and only cross the road at the traffic lights, and of course, be careful. They really didn't think anything could go wrong as lots of kids walked home from school around the same time. Just 10 days after her 9th birthday, on April 22nd, she left school. This time, strangely, she decided to cut through an overgrown vacant lot near the North Rockhampton High School. And this wasn't her normal route home, as she was told to stay on the sidewalk. It's speculated that maybe she was uncomfortable with someone following her and wanted to take a shortcut home. This person was Leonard Fraser. He had noticed Kyra walking home the day before and followed her. He even stood beside her at the lights to cross Dean Street and watched her walk the rest of the way home. Seeing him a second day in a row could have made her quite nervous. Witnesses, mostly other school kids, would also remember seeing Leonard walk along Berserker Street both days. He carried a cigarette in his left hand, was shabby looking, and wasn't wearing any shoes. When Kyra cut through the tall grass on the acre of bare land, Leonard Fraser made his move. He ran up behind her and sucker punched her in the back of the head, knocking her tiny body down. Her parents are hopeful that she probably didn't feel a thing. Kyra also loved to sing, so her parents want to believe that she was happy walking home, singing her favorite songs. The punch that Leonard hit her with caused a 40mm fracture basically from one ear to the other. She was probably concussed immediately, but Leonard would hit her again and again, knocking out 2 of her teeth. He then brutally attacked her in the tall grass while she bled out. Some neighbors, Lynette and Kara Kieran, lived across the street from the empty lot. And every day they sat out on their veranda at 3:15 to have coffee, waiting for their own son to come home from school. On this day, they witnessed an unusual, unkept person walking quickly behind a girl towards the lot. And then they witnessed the horrific punch that knocked Kara down. They couldn't see much else as the grass was too tall, but Lynette and her teenage son, who was home now, were sure they could see the man's body moving up and down in a motion that resembled sex. Eventually, the man tore off his white shirt and threw it along with Kira's blue backpack into nearby bushes. Her shoes were thrown in another direction, and then he picked Kira up and placed her out of view in even longer grass. Leonard then took off running. Minutes later, the man returned with a Mazda 626, backed his car up into the field, opened the trunk, put Kira inside, and quickly drove away, screeching his tires as he left. The Kierans did call police, but they made the call anonymously as they didn't want to get involved. Their identities would later be revealed by journalists who traced the call, and the Kierans were treated very poorly by the community for not intervening. Graffiti, hate mail, and abuse from neighbors caused the Kierans to move to another part of the city. Unfortunately, they didn't learn a lesson from this, and they have since said that next time they'd think twice before ever helping anyone out. Anyway, when the anonymous call came in, the police were sent out immediately to the vacant lot where they would collect loads of evidence. There was bare footprints, tire tracks, blood, her backpack, and shoes. Meanwhile, Leonard had gone home, threw his clothes in the washing machine, and told Christine that they were going for a drive. He would drive to the end of the road near Callahan Racecourse and told Christine to look straight ahead and do not turn and look at him. The sun was in her eyes as she looked ahead, and they started to hurt. So at one point, she did look towards Leonard and noticed Leonard remove what looked like a doll from the trunk. Leonard saw that she wasn't looking straight ahead, and he punched her hard in the thigh and threatened to hurt her even more if she didn't listen. So she kept what she saw a secret. Leonard then took the doll into the bush, and she believes about 4 or 5 songs played on the radio before he returned empty-handed. The doll was gone, and they went home. Police released the abduction of Kira to the news and luckily got a very useful tip. A prison officer, Ben Robson, saw on the news that the man in question was barefoot, wearing yellow shorts and a white shirt. Ben had seen Leonard Fraser wear that same outfit earlier that afternoon. Ben was picking up his kids from school when he saw Leonard walking behind a blonde-haired girl near the school. Police would pay Leonard a visit and brought him down to the station for questioning. His apartment and car were declared a crime scene and a search went underway. I assume they got a warrant right away based on the witness statements. In Leonard's apartment, they found children's books, a bag with 3 human ponytails. There was lockable diaries, primary school workbooks, and books of fairy tales belonging to girls he tried to molest in the past. There was also Natasha Ryan's jewelry, a dolphin ring and a choker with a 4-leaf clover pendant. Leonard didn't confess at the station. He denied ever knowing any girl and went on several strange tangents not related to the questions he was being asked. He had no sympathy towards the situation and didn't seem to care that a girl was missing. He would be charged with 1 count of child stealing until they could uncover more evidence. When the news broke out that Leonard Fraser was arrested, all sorts of people called in with stories of assault by Leonard. Women called in saying that they too were followed recently by the same man. Christine Wright turned out to be a good witness in that she would eventually admit to seeing the hair of a girl or doll that he pulled out from the trunk. She also recognized a photo of Sylvia Benedetti, saying that Leonard was friends with her as well as Beverly Lego. While Leonard was being held in jail, the police would speak with criminal Brett Bigness. He was once friends with Leonard and knew him from prison. Brett hated pedophiles, so he volunteered to share a cell with Leonard and he would be an informant. And this plan worked. Right away, Leonard asked Brett, who had just been granted bail, to get a pocket knife that was hidden in his apartment. He didn't go into detail, but said it could connect him to a robbery. Turned out he used that knife on Kira. He had slit her throat to make sure she was dead after removing her from the tall grass. Her DNA would still be on the knife. Traces of blood were also found in the trunk of the Mazda. Blood was also found on cigarette papers in the glove compartment. Grass was found in the car, blood on the steering wheel, the handbrake, and a passenger taillight. Blood was on the mat in the trunk, the gear shifter, ashtray, and driver's seat seatbelt. There were strands of hair found on a shoelace in his apartment, and forensic took samples from his washing machine where strands of hair were found there as well. With all the evidence of blood all over Leonard's car, he still denied everything. He said he loaned his car to a guy named Squeaky the day Kira disappeared. He was also starting to take police on wild goose chases, hinting to them that he might know of good places one would dump a body. He also said he wanted to help find Kira and would hurt whoever took her. Once police got a positive match on Kira's DNA, Leonard finally claimed responsibility for killing her. He volunteered to take police to her resting place, but mentioned that he didn't remember what he did or what happened. It's quite hot in Australia, and this was months later, so unfortunately, the level of decomposition was too far to identify how she died, or any other identifying marks. Sadly, this also meant that the parents couldn't say goodbye. Police had a feeling that Leonard was a serial killer. In his trunk was Kyra's DNA and other female DNA as well. Police would take items from the other missing women's family in the area to build a DNA profile. They also did a huge media spread of missing women of Rockhampton. A former Rockhampton prison officer would come forward saying that he saw Leonard Fraser and someone who resembled one of the missing girls walking down the road holding hands. And this was a week prior to the media release. The prison officer knew it wasn't Christine because he knew Christine. This was someone else, and he thought it might be Sylvia Benedetti. Then police got another break. They were notified of a crime scene in room 13 at the Queensland Hotel, which was described as a bloodbath. A man named Ross found the discovery when he went to assess the final cost of demolition and called police right away. The police also saw all the blood in the bathroom, down the staircase, a smeared handprint on the wall, and her clothes in the old freezer. Forensics were in the middle of running DNA from room 13 when links between Leonard and Julie, as well as Leonard and Natasha, popped up. Now remember, Julie used to talk about Lenny, or Len Fraser, and leaving her husband. Her daughter Kylie called police and suspected Leonard to be the same man that she was talking about. She mentioned that Julie had gone to his apartment and met his disabled sister. And apparently Natasha Ryan's mother used to see Leonard at the squash bowl where she worked. And Natasha used to bowl there as well and spoke to Christine many times. So these women all had been seen with Leonard. On May 24th, Rockhampton detectives were told that the blood from Leonard's Mazda positively matched Sylvia. A week after that, her DNA would be a match to the blood splatter all over room 13 at the Queensland Hotel. In prison, Leonard would brag about being able to punch girls so hard he could knock them out. He also occasionally mentioned that there is bodies missing all over that he was responsible for. Then in August, he confessed to his prison roommate to murdering a girl in a hotel in Rockhampton. He was also worried about other prostitutes that had gone missing too. Leonard was then charged with Sylvia Benedetti's death on November 10th, 1999, as there was substantial evidence in the hotel. Leonard had revealed information to his prison roommate about things that were never released. How her clothes were left in a freezer full of water, how he left a handprint on the wall and tried to wipe it up with a dirty towel. He also mentioned how he put her body over a drain in the bathroom to bleed her out like an animal. Leonard never had any compassion or remorse for what he did. He always called the girls junkies or that no one would miss them anyway. While awaiting charges on missing women on September 7th, 2000, Leonard was found guilty of murdering Kyra Steinhardt and was given an indefinite life sentence. After that trial, he would await a trial for the murder of Sylvia Benedetti. He was given more psychiatric assessments, which revealed he had several types of personality disorders. But they deemed him not mentally ill. Leonard had hoped that he would get off easier if it was due to insanity. Leonard then started to talk about his relationship with Natasha Ryan. He met her in a bowling alley and watched her outside North Rockhampton State High School. She had bought weed from him in the past, and one night she asked for a ride to Yeppoon Beach. She fell asleep in the car and he turned and hit her in the head, killing her. He claimed to have dumped her body near the airport. He then confessed to killing Julie and Beverly, saying that their bodies were near palm trees and that someone may have taken their head off. He did go into a lot more detail as well, but we're not going to get into that. In the end of November of 2000, skeletal remains were found by two surfers at Sandy Point. It was assumed that these were the remains of Sylvia, and when Leonard caught wind of this discovery, he tried to kill himself. When he failed at that, he asked for a pen and some paper and drew maps to where more bodies would be found. 5 maps in total were drawn, presumably to clear his conscience. On December 21st, 2000, Leonard Fraser was granted permission to leave prison to guide the investigators to the victims' remains. Investigators wore hidden cameras and filmed Leonard bragging about himself and how proud he was to take them to these areas. He would lie and say he didn't know who they were, but just that he knew that there was bodies. He knew of missing women from TV, but denied knowing how he knew their locations. He also claimed to have changed his mind of showing where Natasha's body was. If you watched the Natasha Ryan episode that I did, you'll know she was alive and hadn't been killed by Leonard at all. Leonard then implied that he dumped these bodies for someone else, and implied it was that man named Squeaky. He even sent a letter signed by Squeaky to the media, which was a confession of his crimes. Squeaky knew all sorts of information that was never released by the police. The amount of evidence, DNA, witnesses who saw the victims on their last days with Leonard, prison roommates, and his knowledge of knowing where the bodies were made it pretty easy for the jury to decide he was guilty. Leonard was pretty quiet during his trial, except when someone yelled out, "Dog fucker," he got very angry. But they weren't wrong. On May 10th, the jury found Leonard Fraser guilty of murder for Beverly and Sylvia, and he was convicted of manslaughter in Julie's case, which is a bit rude because manslaughter implies he didn't intend to kill Julie. I don't believe that. But anyway, a lot of people wanted the death penalty for Leonard as he is one of the worst kinds of people and cannot be rehabilitated. But Australia doesn't have the death penalty, so he was given 3 life sentences, keeping him in prison for the rest of his life. Leonard was first put on suicide watch as they thought he'd be upset by the verdict, but he didn't care and didn't show any remorse. He was more concerned with not being able to watch stock car races on TV. Thankfully, Leonard died in prison on January 1st, 2007 of a heart attack. My thoughts? What can I say about a serial killer that we all haven't thought before? They're gross, horrible people that don't deserve a spot in this world. Their brains are wired wrong and they have no remorse or empathy. They know right from wrong, but their impulses can't be controlled, and that makes them very dangerous people. I wanted to do this case because we touched on it while talking about Natasha Ryan, and I just found it so strange that she was tied to a serial killer. And I just started doing more and more research, and here we are. What do you think about this guy, or what do you feel about serial killers in general? I'd love to know. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and we'll see you again soon.